Thank you, Provost Burrows. A detour in the provost office is a delight, is it not? Yeah. Yeah. Very good. Dinner conversation. At the risk of overextending the clock, you mentioned or I mentioned, and you repeated in the intro, this selection of pretend majors that I went through. Well, classics was kind of serious for a while, and actually, the first day I was on the Lawrence campus in 1975, I was taken. There was a classics club, or I don't know what it was called, and Professor Dan Taylor organized this, and he brought anybody who was interested in classics into the Hiram A. Jones Latin Library, big wooden table. And at the time, there was a man named Morris Cunningham, who was sort of the founder of classics at Lawrence, at least in the 20th century, and maybe the 19th as well. And he was retired and very erudite, and he looked like one of the busts that is currently in the Hiram Jones Latin Library. And since we're talking about theories of education, and we're at one of those transformational moments again, right? Apparently 1975 was a transformational moment because he didn't talk to us at all about classics, which was, he was supposed to be recruiting us into the department. He said the following, and then he stopped talking. He said, roughly, "There's a lot of talk today about education and theories of education. Well, I have a theory of education," this distinguished Latinist and scholar of Prudentius said. "I have a theory of education, and it is this. Education means getting the person who knows less in the same room with the person who knows more." And that was that. And it's a pretty good theory because it's very open. It's open to Coursera. It's open to all kinds of different things. And I've taken that with me. I hadn't thought of it for years, but here we are, pretty close to the Hiram A. Jones Latin Library. So I'll try to fast forward through the first 6 pages here. So we've been talking about the claims against liberal education, and the stage is set for this part of my talk by previous speakers. We've talked about cost, and we've talked about inefficiency. And I'm going to echo those concerns, but I'm going to try to use the term value in the first part of the talk as another way of thinking about cost and efficiency with maybe a longer-term perspective. And I would say that it's altogether fitting and proper to, in this setting where the liberal arts are presumed to have value, where there's deep investment in them, to suggest that the cost of not doing some of the things that liberal education prescribes, that liberal education teaches, in very high-stakes settings well outside of academia, actually illustrates the value proposition of liberal education from a perspective that we too seldom consider. So we know that the liberal arts encourage certain kinds of values and practices, habits of mind. I'm going to call them the 3 C's: critical thinking, collaboration, and creativity. I'm going to be loftier for a moment and call them the new trivium, since we've heard about the trivium and the quadrivium today. Let's call the 3 C's, for the moment anyway, the new trivium. These attributes we know, we're told by employers and others, have tangible value in a swift and turbulent world. So in a moment, we're going to explore the implications of their absence when they're not present in a little miniature case study where I will be dancing between disciplines, in one of which I'm somewhat comfortable and one of which I'm a complete and rank amateur in the liberal arts tradition. So I'm standing here. Pache, President Beck, and others. I'm standing here, I think, because for a while now I've been working in the theater, making theater, teaching drama, and thinking about how all of that fits into a liberal arts education. And I've also spent my entire life actually trying to keep my left and right brains talking to each other, keeping that corpus callosum activated. And that is what led me to the somewhat whimsical title and indeed the metaphysical conceit of this talk. So by way of gaining your indulgence for this attempt to yoke dissimilar subjects together by whatever means possible, I offer this brief left brain and right brain resume for your safety and comfort, and please keep in mind that the nearest exits may be behind you. So here is a 50-year panorama, also to be titled A Tale of 3 Headsets, of my left brain, right brain conversation. So here is a 6-year-old with his first headset, baby's first headset there, listening to what, God knows what, on the maybe the cat's whisker. And here's the 15-year-old running some actually pretty fancy ham radio gear for 1972. Much better headset, please observe. And finally, my occasional forays into the wild beyonder at the controls of not a Dreamliner, but a Piper Cherokee with a really, really good headset. So that's it. Those are my credentials for the talk today. And it brings us to the subject of our talk, A Midsummer Night's Dreamliner. So at the turn of the millennium, the good people of Boeing had a dream. They wanted to build an airplane unlike any other that had ever been built, and they called it the Sonic Cruiser. This is an airplane that would reclaim the terrain from the failed experiments of Concorde and the Tupolev Tu-144, the Soviet supersonic transport, which failed for economic and environmental reasons and basically never made anybody a dime, and then started crashing and then were withdrawn. But they never built this airplane, did Boeing, because the September 11th attacks restructured the air transport industry along with much other in American society. So by the end of 2002, Boeing actually changed their mind, decided not to build this revolutionary design, and they built an airplane which became the 787. The first airliner with a mostly composite airframe, along with many other fantastic innovations in design and aerodynamics, construction, equipment, etc., designed to go faster, fly higher, use less fuel, make less noise, and actually just be a whole lot more fun than any other airplane currently flying passengers. And the first to be built with 60% of the design and production outsourced. So brief history of the 787. It rolled out of the factory in 2007, already fairly behind schedule. It was supposed to enter service in May 2008, but the maiden flight, which is the first step in a long flight test series leading to FAA certification, didn't occur until late 2009. The airplane had been sitting on the ground for 2 years, basically, getting things fixed. Commercial service finally began in 2011, very, very late. And then, of course, came the recent battery troubles, which led to the fleet-wide grounding, and this beautiful airplane is only now beginning to crawl back into commercial service. So this grounding alone has had a combined price tag, including losses for Boeing and its airline customers and the airport and civic infrastructure that airlines serve, of well over $500 million and counting. The years of delays in flight test and in certification and in commercial operation have cost Boeing alone 60 or more canceled orders. That's around $700 million in lost potential revenue. And the company took a $2.5 billion write-down in 2009 against the R&D costs and the production of just the first 3 airplanes. So there's a lot more losses, and happily we don't have time to go into them, but it's a lot, and it affects a lot of people. What went wrong? Let's start with some suggestive, maybe even slightly racy illustrations from that sensationalist rag that I know you read as a guilty pleasure like I do, Supply Chain Forum. This is a diagram of where the 787 comes from. It's called an exploded diagram, which is an unfortunate term for an airliner. Now, according to a book that Boeing itself put out called The Birth of the Dreamliner, beautiful coffee table book, weighs about 20 pounds, this volume produced in 2010, the Dreamliner, the 787, is produced by 50 major suppliers in more than a dozen countries. Now, there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. It certainly could have worked, but it didn't. Things didn't fit. Literally didn't fit when they tried to put it together. Suppliers were endemically late. The all-important, this is scary, the all-important junction of wings and fuselage wasn't strong enough after they put one together, and so it had to be redone at the cost of a great deal of excess weight on a program sold on the concept of radical lightness. In fact, you know, I almost called this talk The Unbearable Lightness of Boeing, but I didn't. So the question is, why didn't this airplane go together like a kit from the hobby shop, like a lot of other great airplanes, more or less, given a few glitches that are endemic to every airplane? But you know, it didn't go together like a lot of other airplanes have done. So now let's look at some more supply chain porn. Here is the traditional supply chain model that Boeing has used to construct basically everything from the Boeing 247 in the 1930s all the way up to the current 777 was the last one that was done this way. Boeing designs everything in-house, pretty much everything in-house. They subcontract a lot of the work out, but then they integrate it together and assemble it in Everett, Washington. It concentrates the risk and the reward in Boeing's hands. It's linear, it's a little slow, but it produced a lot of very, very good airplanes. But now, the 787 is a whole different animal in so many ways. Here is the supply chain model, very, very condensed and simplified for the 787. There are many, many more layers here between Boeing and the suppliers, and the Tier 1 and Tier 2 partners that you see there are both designing and assembling parts of the finished product, and they're sharing the risk. So Boeing is still doing the final assembly, but in much bigger chunks and in many fewer steps. They even had to create a special 747 called the Dreamlifter to transport the big chunks to Washington State and South Carolina, where they do the final assembly. So recognizing the unprecedented complexity of this scheme, Boeing employed, wouldn't you, a powerful software program called ExoStar. It's a web-based planning and coordination system, very, very powerful and used successfully in many applications. But it failed in this one because the people entering the data sometimes didn't enter the right data, or they didn't enter it in a timely manner. That's human. The worst outcome was that the people receiving the downstream information believed the data because it was on a software program, right? So they actually, Boeing actually sitting in Washington believed what the suppliers were telling them or not telling them, and that led to all kinds of production errors and delays. By the way, this is not an attack on Boeing. It's a great company. Hello out there. And our friends at Airbus have exactly the same problem. The A380 program has had very similar issues, although not as severe. Wiring redos, and actually, here it comes again, wing attachment bracket cracks. So when I flew on an A380 over to Paris last summer, I was watching the wings very carefully. What would I have done? I don't know. And then over on the defense side, just to keep this equal opportunity, so the Lockheed Martin F-35 and other programs have very similar issues. Common to all is a few things. Radical innovation and complexity in design, with emphasis on the word radical. Untested propositions around key processes, and a rosy belief in the effectiveness of technologies alone to mitigate error and ensure communication and coordinate effort across widely distributed sites. So how could Shakespeare have saved the 787? Sorry to say, there is no canonical answer encoded in the canon unless you read King Lear as a parable about outsourcing and corporate supply chain. So don't break up that corporate kingdom. Look, it's the same diagram, isn't it? And I didn't make that up. That's really how that play works. Anyway, but if you'll allow me to let supply chain stand as a metaphor for how things get done in the world, in whatever sphere, and if you'll allow Shakespeare to stand for the theater, and you'll allow theater to stand for the arts, we're going to finally fix that airplane. So in about 1977 or so, again, I was a student here, we had a wonderful drama scholar named Robert Corrigan. He came to give a guest lecture over in Riverview Lounge, and he spent an hour and a half etymologizing the word rehearse. So, I don't have time to do that. But let me start there as we try to save the 787. Whoops, I skipped a slide. No, I didn't. Sorry. Technology is not my friend. So there's Shakespeare in headsets there, looking on askance. Now I'm going to go forward. There we are. So in A Midsummer Night's Dream, from which this quote is drawn, Peter Quince, one of the fortuitously named rude mechanicals, calls together his players in a secluded grove to rehearse. And I'm going to posit now that rehearsal is a model for critical thinking and collaboration in the liberal arts tradition, and useful across disciplines as we dance among them. Thank you, Brian Pirtle. In a rehearsal, people come together around a common task, the creation of a production. An idea is developed, conditioned by contextual research that creates what we like to call a knowledge environment around the world of the play, including questions like, who are these people? When do they live? Where do they live? What do they know and believe? What are they afraid of? What do they want? Who do they love? Who's in charge? What's at stake in their world? All of that and much more lies in the matrix behind each theatrical moment. So that idea springs to life as a proposition. It's then put into action in the form of a line of dialogue which an actor interprets through inflection and movement. And then that idea is tested experimentally on a moment-by-moment basis in the responses of the director and the other actors who must try to incorporate and accommodate that impulse in their own work. At intervals, the process pauses for analysis, and then that analysis is fed back. And sometimes this analysis is at the level of the individual syllable in language. Sometimes it is on the level of the grandest philosophical ideas. But it is then incorporated back into the next cycle of creation, and so it goes. Now, it should be clear that the same recursive process occurs in any act of artistic creation, even if the rules of engagement in the dance studio and the atelier and the orchestra hall are somewhat different. And the teaching of the arts has always been modeled on the same principles as their creation. The union of pedagogy and practice that we now think of as being rediscovered across disciplines has never been absent from the arts. It's never been possible to teach the arts any other way. Because rehearsal precedes performance, we learn to perform by rehearsing. Proposition, analysis, revision, and then repeat. All day, every day, for a lifetime. So to me, that sounds like a pretty good example of this new trivium in action. And not just as criteria for assessment or a rationale for turning STEM to STEAM, whatever that means, but as a habit an inescapable practice and a worthy foundation stone of the modern liberal education. So quickly, could a rehearsal-based supply chain model have saved the 787 or blunted recent unpleasant developments in the financial sector, in foreign policy, in energy, in higher education? Choose your favorite home field. That, as Shakespeare would say, is the question. The answer might help us frame the value proposition of a liberal education in a more, how should I put it, grounded way. How expensive is it to create or reclaim these habits of mind in the broader culture using the bully pulpit of higher education in the liberal tradition? How expensive is it not to? It's impossible to rewrite history, of course, but we can imagine ourselves back into a series of questions that on the evidence of the results never got asked, but which are or ought to be the stuff of the liberal arts classroom, the rehearsal hall, and the supply chain design meeting. Can I try it this way? Does this work? If we do this, what will happen? Is that what you intended? Do you see what I'm trying to do? Are we ready for this next step? Do you understand me? Is this a good idea? Does anyone have a better one? What do you think? So we ask those kind of questions every day when we work on Shakespeare. And I think they could have saved the 787. I actually think they could save the world. What do you think? Thank you.